Thank you very much for coming. The last time I was in this room was for the memorial service for J. Anthony Lucas, who is one of our most distinguished writers, the author of Common Ground about race and class in Boston. And Tony, during the course of his distinguished career, had a considerable conflict with one of the institutions that I'll be talking about in a few moments, the New York Times. So when I think of this, when I come into this room, of course, I think of Tony. My book is about the Kennedy assassination. It began as a biography of Jim Garrison. For those who don't remember and who don't even remember Oliver Stone's movie, he was district attorney of Orleans Parish, a place that no longer exists. And he remains the only public official ever to have brought anyone before the bar of justice for participation in the conspiracy to murder President Kennedy. Garrison assumed that role because he discovered that the person framed for the crime, a low-level intelligence agent named Lee Harvey Oswald, resided in his jurisdiction between April and September of 1963. The biblical metaphor is inevitable. That great harlot city, New Orleans, destroyed by flood, with among its many sins incubating the Kennedy assassination. After his suspect Clay Shaw was acquitted, and Clay Shaw was the man whom the new evidence reveals was a CIA operative guilty of participating in the implementation of the murder of President Kennedy, Garrison was asked how he imagined he could convict someone of conspiracy in the murder of President Kennedy in a Louisiana state court. Garrison said, "I guess I thought I was living in the country I was born in. He wasn't, and we aren't." I'd like to suggest that the truth about the Kennedy assassination, far from being a matter of interest only to historians, and not even to most of them, will help us understand how we arrived at a point where people as respectable as New York Attorney Martin Garbus are comparing the current US government with the rise of fascism in the mid-20th century. It's my belief that the present state of our political culture is a direct result of the fact that those responsible for the murder of President Kennedy have never been brought to justice. To sum up, A Farewell to Justice suggests that the clandestine service of the CIA not only covered up the truth about the Kennedy assassination, that's easy to demonstrate from the 4 million documents now residing at the National Archives, but organized the event itself. That the CIA escaped without penalty, this extraordinary fact, has been integrated over these 42 years into the body politic. It has produced a political culture where the unthinkable has become accepted practice. Meaningful freedom of the press has fallen into serious jeopardy. For a flagrant example of what we have come to, we might revisit the scantily reported exchange on December 1st between Notre Dame professor Doug Castle and John Yoo, a former Deputy Assistant to Attorney General John Ashcroft, a participant in the writing of the Patriot Act, and now a Berkeley law professor. The subject of the debate was the illegal expansion of presidential powers. Professor Castle asks, if the president deems that he's got to torture somebody, including by crushing the testicles of the person's child, there is no law that can stop him? And Yoo answers, no treaty. Castle follows up, also no law by Congress? That is what you wrote in the August 2002 memo. And Yoo replies, I think it depends on why the president thinks he needs to do that. If Professor Castle's hypothetical question seems melodramatic, we have Martin Garbus, alarmed by the twin expansion of presidential and police powers, writing in the New York Observer, quote, this country is approaching a dangerous turning point, and suggesting that the United States today bears some similarities to Weimar Germany, where liberal democracy was not able to contend with the fascist onslaught. In Miami a few weeks ago, I was struck by the omnipresence on the streets and restaurants of police officers from a variety of law enforcement agencies. Famously, Benjamin Franklin replied to a question of whether this new land should be a monarchy or a republic with the line, a republic if you can keep it. What begins as surveillance moves to wiretapping, then COINTELPRO tricks, and finally to murder. A diagram of what happened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and why the illegal NSA surveillance is so alarming. We have not been aided in understanding the meaning of the Kennedy assassination by the continued public silence of those closest to President Kennedy. One day I requested of one of Jim Garrison's law school classmates, Tulane School of Law, class of 1949. Is Wilmer Thomas here tonight? He called me this morning and there he is. Wilmer, hi. I asked Wilmer to ask his acquaintance, Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr., whom he believed was behind the assassination of President Kennedy. Professor Schlesinger observed quietly, "We were at war with the national security people." That the CIA at its highest levels exacted its revenge on President Kennedy has been an open secret since 1963. A Gallup poll on the 40th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination in 2003 found that twice as many people believed that the CIA was implicated in the assassination as there were who accepted the official fiction that Oswald had acted alone. In 1963, people were already worried about the CIA's extraordinary use of its powers. In the New York Times, Arthur Kroc wrote in October 1963 that if ever there would be a coup in the United States, it would, quote, come from the CIA and not the Pentagon. The CIA, Kroc wrote, was a malignancy on the body politic. It is difficult to imagine such words being printed in the Times today. So profoundly has our freedom of the press eroded since the time of the Kennedy assassination. After the death of President Kennedy, ex-President Harry S. Truman, under whose watch the CIA was created in 1947, wrote on the front page of the Washington Post that the CIA had been running a shadow government, becoming operational. Truman declared that the CIA was in urgent need of correction. Brazenly, Allen Dulles at one point even told a reporter, Allen Dulles, of course, was director of Central Intelligence, even told a reporter to think of the CIA as, quote, the State Department for unfriendly countries. The CIA's policy making also involved interference in the electoral process in France and Italy, funneling money to certain political parties. In Italy, it was the Christian Democrats, whom the CIA funded in an effort to prevent a coalition of socialists and communists from taking power. The assassination of Prime Minister Aldo Moro was connected to that CIA campaign. At the time of the assassination, Charles de Gaulle remarked that John F. Kennedy, whom he admired, had died as a result of an intra-government conflict, a situation not uncommon in many countries. The documentation available since the passage of the JFK Act in 1992 overwhelmingly supports de Gaulle's view. The rubber stamping of the Warren Report by the press in 1964 seems to mark the moment when the mainstream press became embedded in official versions of events. Traces of that process have surfaced. In April 1967, the CIA issued a memo, available now at the National Archives, I wish the New York Times would read it, instructing friendly reporters on how to reply to challenges to the Warren Report, recommendations that have resurfaced in the past few years in a renewed set of attacks on Jim Garrison a decade after his death. So it should come as no surprise that the New York Times for a year covered up the National Security Agency domestic surveillance of citizens with rubber-stamped search warrants issued under a, quote, Foreign Intelligence Services Act run by the Pentagon, or with no warrants at all. Only when their own reporter was about to publish a book detailing the evidence did the Times run that story. It should be horrifying that the congressional debate about the Patriot Act has been not whether there should be a government capability, but how long it should be extended. Ponder the Times treatment of Jim Garrison and later of Oliver Stone, who dared to make a film with Jim Garrison as its central character. When Garrison's first book, A Heritage of Stone, appeared in 1969, John Leonard gave it a positive review in the Daily Times. In his final paragraph, Leonard recounted a few of Garrison's challenges to the Warren Report. Something stinks about this whole affair, Leonard writes. Why were Kennedy's neck organs not examined at Bethesda for evidence of a frontal shot? Why was his body whisked away to Washington before the legally required Texas inquest? Why? By the next edition, Leonard's final paragraph had vanished. A third of a column slid down the memory hole. And one of the people Jim Garrison liked to invoke often was George Orwell. And in fact, he nicknamed one of his investigators Winston Smith. Of course, most people didn't recognize where the reference came from. Leonard's review now closed with these words. Frankly, I prefer to believe that the Warren Commission did a poor job rather than a dishonest one. I like to think that Garrison invents monsters to explain incompetence. It was an extraordinary example of management censorship of